Our next project is going to be based off the idea of portraiture. Now, I'm sure many of you have seen portraiture and have, or maybe even had your portrait taken or drawn. But for this project, I want you to think about what the deeper meaning of portraiture can be. So, not just about the likeness of a person, but how it can also show mood, personality, or even other concepts entirely. For this piece, I'm going to ask you to take an original image, a photograph that you can work from. So I'm going to give you some ideas. We're going to look at a few different portraits, and I want you to kind of think about this in relationship to your own artwork that you are going to create. This first image that we're looking at is an image of two figures looking at each other. Do you have any idea about what the meaning of this piece could be? Do you think that the figures know each other? Well, they appear to have an intimate connection, right? We can tell by where their eyes are focused, right? They're looking at each other directly in the eyes. This is something you can think about when you're creating your portrait. Do you want your sitter to be looking directly at the viewer? Do you want it to be looking at or them to be looking at another person or object or image in the piece? Having the sitter look at something really helps to create a story or a narrative. We also, you can tell by how they're sort of embracing each other. You can see that young boy's hand sort of on the older man's chest there. We know that they probably have an intimate connection, right? The older man has his arm wrapped around him. What relationship do you think that these two have? Is it grandfather son? Or could it even be illustrating the idea of life's journey, right? That old man was once a young boy himself. If you look at the background, you see there's that winding road leading back to somewhere. That also might imply that there's some sort of a journey happening. So think about that. All these things are important. Where the figure's looking, what the figure's doing in the piece, but also the background can tell a part of the story. So that's something to consider when you're deciding what visual resources to get together for your portrait. Here's another example of a child portrait. Now, originally, a painting or a drawing was the only way that you could record a person's image for the future. And that's another important part of portraiture, right? That you're capturing that moment in time for someone, possibly loved ones, to look back and remember someone with, right? And this was a really important aspect of portraiture for a long time and still is today. I'm sure a lot of people have had or have taken their child's portrait at different ages so they remember what they looked like. This went back on even back in the 1800s, as you can see from this piece. Is there anything that looks kind of odd about the girl, right? She has a very detailed face, which is always an important part of the portrait. But the rest of her looks sort of stick figure like, right? It's almost as if the body and arms almost fit to a different figure entirely. This was a very common practice at the time. As you can imagine, prior to photography, it was very difficult to draw or paint a portrait. You had to have the sitter sit there for very long periods of time, right? 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. A small child is not going to sit for that long. So oftentimes the artist would just focus on the face and then use sort of the general same body, arms on multiple children. They'd often let them pick the color of the dress. They maybe didn't even come in wearing that dress. And pick little props that they could sit around the child. So you can see they've got the mistletoe for good luck and the little dog which means fidelity. So you could pick different things depending on what you wanted your portrait to be like. Well, that's something you can think about. Often having those little objects or little things around your sitter can tell a story or tell something about their personality. This is another portrait from a similar time. Also, you can sort of see that very stiff body. At this time, the clothing that this woman chose to wear were meant to help tell a story about who she was. Do you think that this is a woman who was lower in society or higher in society? Well, if you guessed higher in society, you're right. We have a couple clues. One, she's wearing a black dress. Black fabric at this time was very expensive, so it was seen as a sign of luxury. You can also tell by those fine um, silk shawl she has on and her little details on her cuffs. Also, from the background, she was the wife of someone who was very important in as a merchant. So you can see that's illustrated in her background, sort of telling the story of who she is as well. Does anybody know who this is? This is our first president, right? George Washington. Now, if you notice, there's not much of a background in his piece telling us about who he is. Just that green, plain green background. Well, it's used for a couple reasons. One, it's meant to help draw attention to the face of the figure. George Washington being our first president, um, the fact that there was no photography and that they wanted future generations to know what George Washington looks like, the artist, Gilbert Stuart, really wanted the viewer to focus on the face. So using a plain background, green is a complementary color, so it sort of brings out the color of the face, is meant to draw attention to the features of his face. Even his clothing kind of fades out as it goes to the background, right? So those are some tools that the artist used to help draw attention to the face, that light behind him as well. The green of the background also is meant to symbolize sort of a tent tarp, right? He was a general in the army. One of the reasons why he was the first president is because he led us to victory in the Revolutionary War. But it makes this great compositional tool as well. The interesting thing about this particular portrait of George Washington, it was often used by artists to actually make copies of the likeness of George Washington. So the dollar bill, for example, is a copy of this portrait of Gilbert Stuart. If you've been, or back when we can go back into the De Young Museum, there's a portrait of George Washington that has been copied from this original Gilbert Stuart piece. So the piece itself was an important document of what George Washington looked like, even for other artists and other replications of his image. Here's another well-known piece by John Singer Sargent, who's a very well-known portrait artist at his time, and it's called Madam X. Now, as you notice on a lot of these titles, oftentimes the title is the name of the person whose portrait has been painted. This case, it says Madam X. The reason for that is when the person who paid to have her portrait painted saw this painting, she was horrified and asked for it to be destroyed. She did not want this image of herself. John Singer Sargent liked the image. The image became a sort of a French scandal at the time. And it's not for the reasons you might initially think. The artist has depicted the woman in sort of a lovely nightgown, which might seem a little bit risque for the time period that we're looking at during the Victorian age. But surprisingly, that is not the part that caused the controversy. It's actually a very small little detail. if you look at the ear of the woman, you can see it's got sort of a reddish tint to it, right? John Singer Sargent, just because he was an artist does not make him a good person, felt like Madame X was someone who had wrongfully worked her way into the aristocracy and the upper class, that she had used her good looks to trick people. Um, and a signifier at this time was that if you were part of the wealthy, you didn't go outside and work. Um, you had very light colored skin. Like I said, John Singer Sargent, not necessarily a good person at all, just because he's an artist. Um, and he, you know, he was showing that to have this sort of light porcelain skin, she had to cover herself with makeup. And the one place that she couldn't hide her true background was her ears, right? So you can see the natural color of her skin in her ears. So, um, and this caused a scandal. French society was not a great place to live. Um, and at the time, and as you can see, this was something that a small little tiny piece caused a big controversy. So think about those little details in your piece and how much meaning you can bring by just paying attention to something little. Mary Cassatt was another portrait artist working at this time, one of the few women working artists at the time. She was known for her portraits of women and children, and it was unfortunately some of the she was forced by society to really focus on women and children, because not very many women were allowed to work outside of the home at the time. She's actually an American artist, but had went to live and work in Europe for that reason. So you can see this is a self-portrait, and during these kind of Victorian times, this was seen as a very different pose. Not necessarily a feminine pose, but kind of like a tough pose, right? She decided to depict herself as sort of independent. Um, she's got that kind of look to her, like she's really um, sort of looking at ready to take on society almost, right? She's showing her independence. Um, and you can see she is trying to take some of her personal attitude and bring that out in her piece. So that's something you can think about. The pose, the way the person is standing, those can all be important aspects of your piece. Okay, so this is a more contemporary painting. These are the official portraits of the Obamas. Every president, when they leave office, has a official presidential portrait painted of them. And these two portraits have been very controversial from the time they were completed in 2018, but for a variety of reasons. Amy Sherrill's piece of Michelle Obama was controversial. One, because it's takes some abstractions of the artist and herself, and as you can see, the skin color was done with sort of a graphite powder and has sort of a not as lifelike look to it, which is actually part of Amy Sherrill's personal style. It does have to do with race and race depictions of dark skin. So there is a conceptual element to why she's choosing to render the skin like that. And she also has chosen to place her into a dress that is symbolic, that has used patterns from Southern quilts. So there's sort of a concept even to the dress that she's wearing. Kahande Wiley's piece of Obama caused an even bigger controversy. And there's a variety of reasons for that as well. Here is an image of the last few presidential portraits. Can you think of any reasons why Obama's stands out as different? Well, one reason is that Kahande Wiley is the first African American artist to be chosen to paint any of the American president's portraits. So that is one big difference. But Obama also chose someone who's not considered a traditional portrait artist. So you can see, typically it's the president sitting there in the office, you know, looking presidential, holding a paper, looking at other things. Obama's is very different from that, right? He's sitting in this garden or wall of ivy, right? And kind of while he chose these all for symbolic reasons, and that he was thinking about Obama's background, how he was, one of the people, showing his roots from Hawaii. He was really thinking about those things as he chose to paint his portrait. And, kind of Wiley, another reason that this particular artist was seen as controversial at the time is not someone who has hidden from race-related issues in his paintings. Originally, which is one of the articles that we're going to look at in our discussion post, a lot of people were upset about this particular painting of his from 2012, which is Judith chopping off Holofernes' head. You can see it here, because it talks about race tensions. And Conde Wiley, his work redepicts historical paintings showing what were previously only upper class aristocracy, kings, queens, historical events. And who do you think was depicted in those? Mostly white Europeans, right? And he chooses African Americans and allows them to pick their favorite painting and redepicts it. So just by, instead of having a white woman chopping off a head and placing an African American woman chopping off someone's head, it suddenly talks about race tensions, even though this painting has existed in the past with a white woman depicting the same act of violence. And one of the things about Conde Wiley's pieces are that they are beautifully painted. The way he depicts skin color, the details of the face, the lighting, hair, everything is beautifully painted. And you can see that in his rendering of Obama as well. The details are gorgeous, right? And he has the figure up against this very flat pattern background. That's sort of his individual style. And the fact that he continued that individual style into the piece is also very different from previous presidential portraits. That he was showing, using contemporary abstract painting alongside realistic renderings. And this is something you can actually think about doing in your piece. You can have elements that are very realistic, like within the face, but you could do something completely different in the background, something abstract or patterned or something you wanted to talk about entirely differently. Just so you know, Obama's portrait was not the first or potentially the last of presidential portrait scandals. This is Bill Clinton's portrait, original portrait that he had painted and revealed, that he actually decided to recommission. He was so upset with the results. particularly after the portrait had been revealed. You know, they have this big portrait reveal where the former president gets to see his portrait. Bill Clinton was particularly upset because the artist said he had used some symbolism in the piece to symbolize the Monica Lewinsky scandal. So that shadow that you see underneath the ivy that's not really there for any particular reason, you can't see what has cast that bluish shadow. The artist has said he meant to symbolize the shadow of the Monica Lewinsky scandal sort of overriding his presidency. And if you can kind of see, he's got his jacket open and kind of got a weird finger thing pointing towards the shadow. That was also kind of seen as offensive. And the artist mentioned that he had made those particular choices for those conceptual reasons. So you will not see this portrait anymore. Bill Clinton actually paid to commission this second portrait of himself that is now in the National Collection, which I think this one compositionally is just not as interesting as the previous portrait, but you can see why he decided to choose a safer route the second time around. Chuck Close is another contemporary artist, and his pieces are very realistic and abstract at the same time. He works within this gridded process. Chuck Close was uh, actually has lost a lot of ability to move his hands and walk because of a viral infection that happened later in life. But he still chooses to create his pieces through the same processes that he created works like this, which are sort of super detailed, but he uses them through a gridding process, um, similar to what I will show you when we start to map out these pieces initially, because the gridding process helps you to really focus in on smaller details of the face. So you can really hone in on those tiny little hairs, uh, even the little bits of smoke that's coming out of his cigarette. It's also something to think about. We've seen a lot of the portraits so far where it's full body, half body. Chuck Close really just focuses on the face with very plain backgrounds. He was very interested in focusing in on those details of the face, so those compositional choices of the cropping and background help to allow the viewer to really focus in on those elements. So that's something to think about. You can have a very plain, clean background if you want to focus in on your sitter's face. This is sort of the exact opposite of Chuck Close's work. This is a piece by Gerhard Richter, his self-portrait. And it almost looks like kind of a blurry portrait, right? It's like somebody took a picture where the camera wasn't totally in focus. And Gerhard Richter, that's actually what he's interested in. He's interested in the idea of how our memories are tied to photographs and photography's role in our understanding of images. So oftentimes he will try to replicate the photograph exactly as it is, with its blurry effect, with the highlight of the flash. It's something to think about because we are going to be working from a photograph. How much you're sticking to that reality of what the photograph is. And, if you had a blurry photograph like this that you were working from, it would be very hard to get those details that you see in the Chuck Close piece. So the quality of your photograph is really important. And like I said, if you're interested in doing something that's blurry, that's something that you could think about doing. But if you're interested in doing something very detailed, you're going to have to set up your photograph to help you represent that. Jennifer Nairbass is another contemporary artist who's interested in photography and really our manipulation of it. She formerly worked as a fashion magazine editor, and she's really interested in how we manipulate photographs and view them as reality, right? So she has some very realistic elements. The two girls look very realistically rendered, but the background starts to suddenly depict into much flatter, sort of altered spaces, which makes the viewer question what's real and what's not. Is a photoshopped photograph real where you've taken out all those imperfections? Or has it become something else entirely? So it's something to think about, right? And this is another one of her pieces. So there's elements that are very realistic, right? The face and the hair, but then you have other parts that become these totally almost like Photoshop collage rendered spaces. That's something you could think about too. You could have elements that are decorative and have elements that are totally realistic. So for this post, you are going to take 3 images, 3 photographs, and you want to think about depicting a mood or emotion or personality of the subject. Make sure you have high contrast images using a light source. Remember to consider your background. For example, if you're thinking about doing something different with like the figure or the background, sometimes it's easier to have a totally um, white blank space or have nothing behind the person you're choosing to paint or draw, right? So it kind of gives you just like a blank space that's easier to see. Make sure you take more than one image so you have choices. You do have to be working from an original image, so nothing that you've taken from Google search or anything like that. I have had people in the past use uh, like old family photographs. That's something you can definitely use because that's still considered an original image. If you want to use it, you can take a picture of the photograph and upload it to this post.